Hello. Welcome to Ghost Stories for Christmas. I'll be reading Greetings by John McNee. Are you sitting comfortably? We'll soon fix that. Try to imagine a classic Victorian winter scene. Men in top hats, women in long frocks and furs, their children bundled up in caps, scarves and mittens, all engaged in leisurely pursuits on and around a frozen pond. Whatever you're picturing will likely be very close to the painted image Harold Wingate held in his hand. The Christmas card, in which a simple message was written. Season's greetings to my favourite local councillor, from your faithful constituent, Jim Donahoe. Margaret! He called for his wife as he moved down the hall. The new house into which they'd recently moved, perhaps more accurately described as a mansion, had so many rooms it was easy to lose her for hours. Usually he was grateful. I'm in here, she answered from the conservatory. Look at this. He thrust the card into her face over the top of her book. With some reluctance, she took it into her hand and studied it. Who's Jim Donahoe? Never mind that, he said. It's 30 years since I was a councillor. And how many people have our new address? Only immediate family, she said, then qualified. My immediate family. For Harold, privacy was an absolute essential. After a lifetime of committed and admittedly lucrative public service, his goal in retirement was seclusion, introspection and relaxation away from all the petty, puerile problems of the common man. He felt he'd earned that much, in addition to what he'd received from his annual salary, expenses, gifts, and considerable pension. He said, well, how the bloody hell did... What was his name? Jim Donahoe. How does Jim Donahoe know where I live? It's completely unacceptable. I don't know, dear, she spoke to him with a calm bordering on fatigue. Through the computers, I expect. You're probably on a list of some kind. Curse of the modern age. I can look into it if you'd like. Later. Margaret had always been better at dealing with such matters. When he was a member of Parliament, the local rags had made headlines from the fact Harold had paid his wife a salary from the public purse to act as his private secretary, but of course what they failed to appreciate was her exceptionally good value. Even now her skills were of great benefit to him. Please do, he said. It needs sorting out. Completely unacceptable. He was walking away when she said, Doesn't it look just like the ones we used to send out every Christmas? Remember? To party members, campaign donors, favoured constituents, local businessmen and minor celebrities you wanted to impress. You bought them in bulk and had me sign your name on them. Hours and hours it took me, do you remember? He didn't. I was probably doing more important things at the time. Oh well, she said, rising from her armchair. Might as well pop it on the mantelpiece. Help the place look a bit brighter. We'll be receiving so few this year. But she was wrong about that. The following Monday, Harold stooped at the front door to retrieve the post and found, among the many assorted bills and junk mail, a card almost identical to the first, with an inscription that read, Merry Christmas, Councillor Wingate, and all the best for the new year, Miss Judith Hepburn. And the day after that, to Harold Wingate, have a happy Christmas and thanks for all your efforts on behalf of the ward, Arthur Driscoll. Well, it's quite outrageous, Harold said. I mean, it quite beggars belief. They're all seemingly astute enough to find out my address, but not a one of them seems to know I ceased being a bloody councillor over 3 decades ago. Perhaps they posted them 30 years ago and they've only just arrived, Margaret suggested. Do you know what Royal Mail is like? Harold didn't find the joke terribly amusing, but neither were laughing the following morning when they read the latest card, to Harold Wingate MP, Season's Greetings from Brendan O'Sullivan. Now that was a name they both knew. Brendan O'Sullivan died, along with his entire family, shortly after Harold's first re-election as Westminster representative for the local area. Targeted by drug dealers in an unfortunate case of mistaken identity, his family's house was firebombed while they slept, the villains pouring petrol through the door and setting it alight. The whole building had gone up in minutes, claiming 5 lives. Harold had visited the scene in the aftermath, had the press photograph him laying flowers in the ashes. a name he could never forget. "Why would someone send this to you?" Margaret asked. "It's malicious," he said. "It has to be." "But why?" He didn't have an answer to that. Not one he could say out loud. No one had ever pointed the finger at him for the family's death. Not publicly. There had been some whispers questioning why the building had gone up like a matchbox, suggesting it shouldn't have burned the way it did. But only whispers. Nothing more. Nothing worth investigating. It was a council property, of course. One of hundreds built during Harold's tenure on the planning committee. It had been a crusade of his getting those properties built, providing an answer to the housing crisis and offering secure, comfortable, affordable accommodation to people who needed it. Never an easy ambition to achieve, but he had moved heaven and earth to get it done, utilising every variation of carrot and stick on fellow councillors and planning officers to grease the wheels of progress and see his aims realised. The building contractor who took on most of the work was a close friend and someone who could be relied upon to bring projects in ahead of time and under budget, whatever it took. Harold personally vouched for his skill and professionalism on many an occasion. The result was a whirlwind of construction which left the chiefs of other local authorities seething with jealousy. Harold was never shy about taking the credit for it. He made his commitment to housing a central policy of every election campaign. His achievements in that regard made him the obvious choice when discussion turned to who the party might want as the next candidate for the local parliamentary seat. Taking on the responsibilities of an MP meant he had much more important things to occupy his time than social housing for the area, but those early victories were the foundations on which his entire political career was based, triumphs of which he was still rightly proud. And yes, okay, there had been that wannabe whistleblower who'd come to him ahead of his first general election to make those allegations against the contractor, an odious little bureaucrat by the name of Kevin Unsworth, who claimed to have evidence the building materials used were woefully substandard and posed a risk to human life. Harold had perhaps crossed a line to ensure such evidence was destroyed and Unsworth terrified into silence, but there was a general election to be won. He couldn't risk the damage the scandal of a public inquiry would do to himself or his party, and he was sure no one would want all that wonderful new housing stock to be unceremoniously demolished, as it surely would be, the tenants thrown out into the cold. In any case, the homes were perfectly safe. It would be impossible for any house builder to safeguard against every eventuality, least of all arson, and it wasn't Harold Wingate who lit the match on the fire that killed the O'Sullivans. Someone would have to be doing some pretty extraordinary mental gymnastics to convince themselves or anyone else that he deserved the blame. Yet, day after day, the cards kept coming. Linda O'Sullivan, Christine O'Sullivan, Craig O'Sullivan. Sunday brought a brief respite before Monday's post completed the set with a card from the youngest, 6-year-old Martin O'Sullivan. That made one from every member of the family. "You do know who's doing this, don't you?" Margaret said. "I have my suspicions," Harold replied, meaning Kevin Unsworth, "but he's not worth worrying about." She told him, "I did some research on the other names," and laid out the first 3 cards on the kitchen table. "If you're interested." Arthur Driscoll, she'd learned, was the name of an OAP who burned to death in his council bungalow after trying to use an oiled heater to warm his bedroom. Judith Hepburn fell asleep on her sofa while smoking a cigarette and hadn't escaped her living room. As for Jim Donahoe, his death had been the result of a chip pan fire, hardly remarkable for the times. There was no reason for anyone to look at these unfortunate cases, none of which garnered more than a few paragraphs in the newspapers of the day, and see a connection, let alone one that would lead back to Harold's door. Yet there was a look in Margaret's eyes when she told him each of their fates that could not be interpreted as anything but naked contempt. "It's a vendetta, that's all," he told her, choosing to draw a line under the matter. She said, "If you know who's doing it, you should call the police." He said, "It's nonsense. They'll soon get bored." Though there was no reason to think that. If Kevin Unsworth had been nursing a grudge all those years, fueling the flames with his own sense of self-loathing till finally he decided to focus his cowardly energies on a poison Christmas card campaign, there was no reason to think he'd relent now. But Harold spoke the words for his own benefit as much as hers, kept repeating the line to himself as he went about his day, insisting on it. By the time he went to bed, it had become like a mantra. Yet sleep did not come easy. After waking, he took his time going down the stairs and along the hall to the front door, dreading what he would find there. Yes, indeed, another card. This one from a Mrs. Bernadette Gibson, perished in her sleep after faulty wiring in her fridge sparked an inferno. Not Harold's fault, not anyone's fault. A tragic twist of fate, that was all. How many lives in how many other constituencies across the country had surely been lost in much the same way? And the next day, a card purporting to be from Mr. Saeed Salim, MBE, a much-admired community leader and campaigner for disabled rights, trapped in his bed when fire had ripped through his home, cutting him off from his live-in carer. Harold, who had met Mr. Salim several times at constituency events, spoke to his carer over the phone to offer his condolences. She still blamed herself. Both cards he hid from Margaret, squirreling them away in one of the many spare bedrooms, also a good place to hide with a bottle of scotch. "'Tis the season," he thought, drinking away the day and night in isolation, glad it was only 2 more days till Christmas, surely the end of the vicious campaign. He awoke late and hungover the following morning, and ventured downstairs, dreading what might be waiting for him at the front door. It was a relief to find nothing at all. So Unsworth had finally run out of so-called victims to lay at Harold's feet. And anyway, how bad a list was it when you added it all up? 10 deaths in 6 house fires across a period of nearly 40 years? Hardly shocking numbers when you put it in perspective. Or consider the fact that for the overwhelming majority of residents, the properties proposed, planned and built on his watch had been perfectly safe, and still were. Absurd to blame him for a few deaths. Absurd to blame anyone, really. Why, if half of them had the foresight to install working smoke alarms, they'd probably still be alive. "Margaret!" He called her name as he wandered through the house, eager to tell her the good news. "Margaret!" He found the note she left on the living room mantelpiece alongside the latest card. She'd been the one to find it, of course, and having read it and figured everything out like a proper little detective, had packed a bag and fled to Dorset to spend Christmas with her sister's family. This he considered a ridiculous overreaction even after reading the message. "Dear Harold, season's greetings to you and all the family. Looking forward to seeing you soon. Kevin Unsworth." Well, here we are, Harold thought. At last he admits it. He supposed the man aimed to blackmail him, or guilt him into making some ludicrous confession to the authorities. Confession of what? There was nothing to confess. Should he perhaps confess to going to extraordinary lengths to solve a housing shortage, to going above and beyond, to serve his constituents? He'd happily confess as much. Let anyone try and make him feel guilty or ashamed for it, and see where it got them. He could play Unsworth at his own game. Make a complaint to the police, present the cards as evidence, and get the fool locked up on a charge of harassment. See how many Christmas cards he could send from a cell. Howard liked the thought, but decided not to make up his mind there and then. He'd decide in the new year. In the meantime, he had a full larder, a fuller drinks cabinet, and the house all to himself. Reason enough to celebrate. He went to sleep that night in the living room armchair and awoke the following morning hungover again, but happier, until he got to the front door. A pile of cards awaited him, none of them in envelopes. He plucked the top one from the pile and opened it. Like all the rest, it was made from cheap coloured cardboard and decorated with glue and glitter, the drawings and messages crudely scrawled in crayon and coloured pencil, obviously designed to look like the handiwork of children. Every last one. No, he said to himself. No, no, no. There was no way he could be blamed for that. He refused. He absolutely could and would not be blamed for that. Those had been temporary classrooms. Constructed during his tenure on the planning committee, yes. By the same contractor, yes. No doubt with the same shoddy materials, but they were only supposed to be temporary. It wasn't his fault they were still in use some 3 decades beyond their allotted lifespan. Not his fault the politicians and council officers who came after him couldn't get their act together long enough to replace them. Not his fault some imbecile had decided to put a cheap Christmas tree with malfunctioning lights in the entranceway, the only practical means of escape. The resultant fire was a tragedy. Of that there was no doubt. A tragedy deserving of the national attention it received, but not one for which he could be blamed. Even the inquest could see that. He was already retired when it happened, no longer an MP, not a councillor, not even living in the same constituency. For anyone to blame him for any part of it, to even think of his name in connection, it was absurd. It was beyond absurd. Grotesque was what it was. And yet, here, lying at his front door, and no envelopes, no stamps, which meant that they must have been hand-delivered by Unsworth. There was every chance the fiend was still somewhere on his property, preparing some final violent attack. At the thought, Harold rushed upstairs to his study and grabbed the phone. "Margaret!" he cried, momentarily forgetting she wasn't in the house. He was in a panic, his brain a jumbled, alcohol-addled mess, briefly confused about whether he should dial 999 or the number of the local police office. He nudged his computer out of sleep mode, and the browser opened on the last page Margaret had viewed. It was a news story about Kevin Unsworth, reporting that he had died shortly after the accident at the primary school in a house fire he himself had apparently started. Overcome by grief and guilt, it seemed he had taken his own life in the most horrible fashion. A terrible end. A truly terrible end. In reading about it, Harold finally understood. In the same moment, the card in his hand caught alight. Its flame was immediate, big and angry. It incinerated the card and leapt up his sleeve, spreading quickly to swallow his whole arm. At the same time, the pile of cards at his front door burst into flames, as did the one on his living room mantelpiece, the ones in the kitchen, and those he'd hidden in the spare bedroom. They burned with an aggression and intensity beyond mere heat, fuel, and oxygen, hungry to combust and consume anything and everything. And so they did. Already aflame, Harold ran from the room and tried to flee the building, but soon lost his way, easily done in the maze of rooms and hallways, and collapsed, overcome by the smoke and searing, hellish heat. The house was a new build, designed to his bespoke specification and constructed from the finest materials money could buy. No expense had been spared in providing his dream house, testament to his many great political achievements and optimized for a long and luxurious retirement. In the aftermath of the blaze, no one could explain how it had started, or why the building had burned so fiercely and so quickly, going up like a matchbox. But it did. Thanks for watching, and a reminder that you were listening to Greetings by John McNee. Thanks to John for letting me read his story. I had a really fun time with it. Thanks to Lex Jones for organising all of this, and thanks to George Daniel Lee for his work on the video side of things. Merry Christmas, and I hope you enjoyed your ghost story for Christmas. Thank you.